A millionaire abandoned his pregnant wife without a second thought, chasing success and temptation. But years later, their paths unexpectedly cross again. This time, under circumstances neither of them could have predicted. What happens when the past you tried to forget comes back to change everything? The golden glow of the evening sun bathed the spacious living room in soft light, casting shadows across the polished oak floor and the pristine cream-colored furniture. Emma Whitaker stood by the large bay window, gazing out at the world below. The city hummed quietly beneath her, its pulse steady and indifferent to the turmoil inside her. Her hand, still trembling slightly, rested on her stomach, a stomach that, just this morning, had delivered her life's most shocking and beautiful news. She was pregnant. The thought brought a soft smile to her lips as she traced circles over her abdomen, imagining the life blooming within her. For months, she and Nathan had talked about building their future. And though his career consumed much of their time, she believed that this moment would anchor them back to the love that had once felt unshakable. Tonight, she would share the news with him over dinner, a home-cooked meal, something they hadn't shared in weeks due to his late-night meetings and business travels. As she set the last plate on the table, she heard the familiar jingle of Nathan's keys in the front door. The sound that once made her heart flutter now filled her with an uneasy anticipation. She smoothed down the front of her blouse, taking a deep breath to steady her nerves. The door swung open, and Nathan Thornton strode in, his leather briefcase slung over his shoulder and his phone glued to his ear. Dressed in a tailored navy suit that hugged his broad shoulders perfectly, he exuded the confidence of a man who had built an empire from nothing. His dark hair was slightly tousled, and the faint scent of his cologne, earthy and luxurious, filled the entryway as he walked past her without so much as a glance. "Hold on," he murmured into the phone, covering the receiver with his hand for a moment. "Emma, I'll be quick. Just need to finish this call." He kissed her cheek absent-mindedly before disappearing into his home office. Emma's shoulders sagged, but she shook off the disappointment. It wasn't unusual for Nathan to be absorbed in work. Tonight would be different, she told herself. After he finished his call, they would have dinner, and she would finally share the news that could change everything. 15 minutes passed, then 30. When Nathan finally emerged, rolling up his sleeves and loosening his tie, Emma plastered a smile on her face and gestured to the dining table. "Dinner's ready," she said softly. He glanced at the table and offered a half-smile. "You didn't have to go through the trouble." "I wanted to," she replied, sitting across from him as they began to eat in relative silence. The clinking of silverware against ceramic plates was the only sound between them until Emma cleared her throat, her voice barely above a whisper. "Nathan, there's something I want to tell you." He looked up from his plate, his brow furrowing slightly. "What is it?" Her heart thumped wildly in her chest, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air like the distant echo of a church bell. For a moment, time seemed to slow, and she held her breath, waiting for his reaction. She had imagined this moment in a dozen different ways. Nathan's face lighting up with joy, him reaching across the table to embrace her, whispering promises of the future they would build together. But that wasn't what happened. Nathan set his fork down, his expression unreadable. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose as if she had just delivered news about a traffic jam. "Pregnant," he repeated, as though testing how the word tasted on his tongue. "When did you find out?" "This morning," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "I wanted to tell you right away, but you were busy," he finished, his eyes drifting toward the large window behind her. He tapped his fingers against the armrest of his chair, the rhythmic sound grating against her ears. "Emma, this is a lot." "I know," she said quickly, leaning forward, "but we can do this. We've talked about having a family someday, and now, someday," he interrupted, his voice firmer now. "Not now." Emma's breath hitched. "What do you mean?" Nathan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Emma, I'm in the middle of one of the most crucial stages of my career. The merger with Foster Tech is weeks away from being finalized, and Claire and I..." Her stomach twisted. "Claire?" Nathan's jaw tightened as he realized his slip. "Yes, Claire's been helping me with the logistics. Emma leaned back in her chair, the warmth that had filled her earlier now replaced by a cold, hollow ache. So, what are you saying, Nathan? That a baby doesn't fit into your plans? He pinched the bridge of his nose, frustration seeping into his tone. I'm saying that this couldn't have come at a worse time. I'm not ready to be a father, Emma. She blinked rapidly, willing the tears to stay hidden. But I'm ready. I want this baby. Nathan stood abruptly, pushing his chair back with enough force to make it scrape against the floor. He paced the room, his hands shoved into his pockets. I need time to think. Emma stood too, her voice rising despite the lump in her throat. Time? Nathan, I've stood by you through every late night, every business trip, every sacrifice you've asked me to make. I've given you years of my life. And now, when I need you the most, you need time? He stopped pacing and turned to face her, his expression hardened. I can't give you what you want right now, Emma. I wish I could, but I can't. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps as she realized the truth. He wasn't going to change his mind. She had always been the supportive wife in the background, but now, with a baby on the way, she couldn't afford to be invisible anymore. Nathan grabbed his briefcase and headed for the door, pausing only to glance back at her. I'm flying to Geneva tomorrow. Claire and I have meetings lined up for the next few days. Emma's voice trembled as she spoke. So, you're leaving me? He didn't answer. Instead, he walked out the door, leaving her standing in the empty room, the weight of his absence crushing her chest. The sound of the door closing echoed like a finality she wasn't ready to accept. Her hand instinctively rested on her stomach as tears streamed down her face. I'm not alone, she whispered to the life growing inside her. We're going to be okay. But as the night stretched on and the silence grew deafening, Emma knew that her world had just been shattered. And now, it was up to her to rebuild it. Before we continue, take a moment to think about this. If you were in Emma's shoes, would you fight to hold on to the relationship, or would you walk away like she did? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel to see how her journey unfolds. The rain tapped softly against the windows, its rhythmic patter the only sound filling the dimly lit apartment. Emma sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, her hand resting protectively over her growing belly. The echoes of Nathan's departure from 2 weeks ago still haunted her, replaying in her mind like a broken record she couldn't turn off. His cold dismissal of their future, his decision to fly off with Claire instead of being by her side. It was all a cruel reminder of how disposable she had become in his life. She hadn't expected to feel this alone. The light on her phone flickered, drawing her attention. She had sent Nathan a message earlier, hopeful that maybe this time he would respond. Her fingers hesitated over the screen as she unlocked it, but the cold, empty inbox confirmed her worst fear. He hadn't replied, just like every other attempt to reach him since he left. Her fingers tightened around the phone before she forced herself to release it. She couldn't cry again. Not today. Instead, she pushed herself off the couch and shuffled toward the kitchen. The smell of lavender from the candles she had lit earlier filled the air, but even their calming scent couldn't ease her restlessness. She stared at the untouched plate of food on the countertop, her appetite non-existent despite the gnawing hunger inside her. The baby kicked gently, a soft flutter that momentarily made her smile through the haze of exhaustion. It's just you and me now, she whispered, resting her hand on her stomach. We're going to be okay. A sharp knock at the door startled her. She wasn't expecting anyone, and the last thing she needed was another visitor offering empty reassurances. But when she opened the door, her heart skipped a beat. Mark? She breathed, staring at the tall figure in front of her. His sandy brown hair was damp from the rain, and his warm brown eyes held a mixture of concern and relief. Emma, he said softly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. I've been trying to call you. She blinked, confused. You have? Mark nodded, setting down the umbrella he had carried. I was worried when I didn't hear back. I wanted to check on you. Emma's shoulders sagged as the weight of her emotions threatened to spill over. Mark had been a close friend of theirs for years, someone she had trusted even when Nathan's priorities shifted. He had always been kind, thoughtful, and dependable. The kind of presence she realized she needed now more than ever. "I'm fine," she lied, wiping at the corner of her eye before the tears could fall. "No, you're not," Mark said gently, stepping closer. "And that's okay." His words broke through her fragile defenses, and before she knew it, the tears she had been holding back flowed freely. Mark didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He simply wrapped his arms around her, holding her as she sobbed into his chest. "I don't know what to do," she whispered between gasps. "Nathan's gone. He doesn't care." Mark's jaw tightened, but he didn't let go. "You don't need him, Emma. You're stronger than you think." They stood like that for several moments, her sobs eventually quieting until only the sound of the rain filled the room again. When she pulled back, Mark handed her a tissue, his gaze steady. "Come sit down," he said, guiding her to the couch. "I brought something for you." From his bag, he pulled out a small stack of documents. "I know this might not be the best time, but I think it could help." Emma frowned, brushing her hair behind her ear. "What is it?" "A job offer," Mark said, handing her the papers. "It's with my company. We're expanding into a new market, and I need someone with your skills to help us strategize." Her heart thudded as she scanned the first few pages. The position was challenging, demanding, and exactly what she used to dream about before Nathan's ambitions consumed their life together. For a moment, the spark of hope she had long buried flickered to life. "But I'm pregnant," she murmured, almost as if reminding herself of the obstacle. Mark smiled. "I know, and we'll work around that. You don't have to make a decision right now, but I want you to know the option is there." Emma set the papers down, overwhelmed by the kindness he was showing her. "Why are you doing this?" "Because you deserve better than being forgotten," he said simply. "And because I believe in you." Those words sank deep, settling in the cracks Nathan's abandonment had left behind. She had spent so long trying to be the perfect wife, the perfect partner, that she had forgotten her worth beyond him. But here was someone offering her a way forward, not as Nathan's discarded wife, but as Emma, the woman who had once been a force to be reckoned with. "Thank you," she whispered, wiping away the last of her tears. Mark nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment before he stood. "I'll check in on you later this week. Call me if you need anything." As the door closed behind him, Emma sat in silence, her mind racing. She hadn't expected this. She had been prepared to endure her pregnancy in solitude, to figure things out one painful step at a time. But Mark's offer was a lifeline, a reminder that she had options. That night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her phone buzzed once again. For a brief second, hope surged through her veins. Maybe it was Nathan finally acknowledging her existence, finally realizing the gravity of what he had done. But when she unlocked the screen, it was only a promotional message from a store she had shopped at months ago. The disappointment hit her harder than she expected, and she turned the phone face down on the nightstand, unwilling to give in to false hope again. Her baby shifted, the tiny movements reassuring her that she wasn't truly alone. She placed her hand on her stomach and took a deep breath. Nathan had made his choice, and she couldn't control that. But she could control what came next. She could rebuild. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the window, casting warm patches of light across the room. Emma sat at the kitchen table with Mark's documents spread out in front of her. She traced her fingers over the words, imagining the possibilities they held. It wouldn't be easy, but nothing worth having ever was. With renewed determination, she grabbed her phone and dialed Mark's number. He answered on the second ring. "Emma?" She exhaled slowly. "I'm ready to discuss the job." Mark's voice lit up with warmth. "I'll set up a meeting for tomorrow." As she ended the call, Emma looked out the window, the world feeling just a little brighter than it had the day before. She wasn't sure where this path would lead, but for the first time in weeks, she felt something she hadn't in a long time. Hope. She didn't need Nathan's approval. She didn't need him at all. And as she prepared herself for the changes ahead, she realized that Nathan had made one critical mistake. He had underestimated her. The soft morning light filtered through the curtains of Emma's modest apartment as she stood in front of the mirror, carefully smoothing down the fabric of her blazer. It wasn't brand new, far from it, actually, but it was one of the few pieces she owned that made her feel like the woman she used to be. Strong, confident, capable. She took a deep breath, running her fingers through her hair before grabbing her purse and heading for the door. Her first day at Mark's company wasn't just about proving her worth to her new team. It was about proving to herself that she could step into this new chapter without Nathan, without the safety net of being someone's wife. As she navigated the crowded subway, her mind drifted back to the moment she had signed the employment contract a week earlier. It had felt like both a terrifying leap and a liberating release, as if she were shedding the skin of the woman Nathan had left behind and stepping into someone new. When the subway came to a stop, she adjusted her bag over her shoulder and walked the remaining few blocks to the sleek glass building where Mark's tech startup was headquartered. The lobby bustled with energy, young professionals with coffee cups and laptops in hand, their conversations filled with innovation and ambition. Emma's heart pounded, but she kept her steps steady as she approached the reception desk. The receptionist, a cheerful woman with bright red hair and a warm smile, greeted her. "You must be Emma Whitaker. Welcome to Whitestone Technologies." Emma nodded, her nerves loosening slightly at the warmth in the woman's tone. "Thank you. Mark is expecting you," the receptionist continued. "He said to bring you straight to the strategy room." Following the directions, Emma stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the top floor. The ride up was smooth but felt endless, giving her time to reflect on how much had changed in such a short span of time. A few months ago, she had been focused on dinner parties, charity events, and making sure Nathan's suits were perfectly tailored. Now, she was here, ready to immerse herself in market research, client acquisition strategies, and corporate growth plans. When the elevator doors slid open, Mark was waiting just outside, a cup of coffee in hand and his usual easy smile in place. "Morning, Emma." "Morning," she replied, accepting the coffee he handed her. "Thanks for this. I figured you might need it," he said as they walked toward the strategy room. "How's the little one treating you?" Emma placed a hand on her small but growing bump, a soft smile touching her lips. "Kicking more than ever." "That's a good sign," Mark said, holding the door open for her as they entered the spacious conference room. The walls were lined with whiteboards covered in diagrams and sticky notes, and the large table in the center was already covered with files, reports, and laptops. Several team members sat around the table, their eyes lighting up when Mark introduced her. "Everyone, this is Emma," Mark said. "She's going to be leading our strategic initiatives for the new market expansion. Trust me, we're lucky to have her." The group exchanged greetings, and Emma quickly found herself immersed in discussions about market trends, competitor analysis, and the upcoming product launch. It felt like slipping into a familiar rhythm, the kind she had long missed. Her ideas flowed naturally, and when one of the analysts raised a question about consumer behavior patterns, she didn't hesitate to dive in with a thorough explanation backed by years of experience. By the time the meeting wrapped up, Emma felt a sense of satisfaction she hadn't experienced in years. As the team dispersed, Mark stayed behind, leaning against the table with an approving nod. "You were amazing in there." Emma smiled, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "It felt good to be back in this world." "You never really left it," Mark said. "You just needed the right opportunity to remind yourself." They spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing key accounts and potential clients, mapping out the next steps for their expansion. By the time Emma finally stepped outside into the cool evening air, the city lights were beginning to flicker on, casting a golden glow over the streets. She inhaled deeply, savoring the crispness of the air and the feeling of accomplishment buzzing through her veins. As she made her way home, her phone vibrated with a call. She glanced at the screen and hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hi, Mom." "Emma, sweetheart." Her mother's voice came through warmly. "How was your first day?" Emma smiled, her heart softening at the concern in her mother's tone. "It was good. Better than I expected, actually." "I'm so proud of you," her mother said, and Emma could hear the genuine pride in her voice. "I know how hard this has been, but you're handling it with such grace." Emma bit her lip, tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. "Thanks, Mom. I needed to hear that." After hanging up, Emma unlocked the door to her apartment and stepped inside, the familiar coziness welcoming her. She set down her bag and kicked off her shoes before heading to the kitchen to prepare a quick dinner. As the aroma of roasted vegetables filled the air, She thought back to the conversation she had had with Mark earlier in the day. "You never really left," he had said. And maybe he was right. Maybe deep down, the woman she used to be, the one with ambition, dreams, and the ability to stand on her own, had always been there, waiting for the right moment to re-emerge. The next few weeks flew by in a blur of meetings, presentations, and late-night brainstorming sessions. Emma thrived under the pressure, her mind sharp and focused as she juggled her responsibilities at work and the demands of her pregnancy. She began to rediscover parts of herself she thought she had lost. The quick wit that kept her colleagues on their toes, the strategic mind that could spot opportunities others missed, and the resilience that had carried her through the toughest moments of her life. One evening, as she sat in the office finishing up a report, Mark appeared in the doorway. "Burning the midnight oil, I see." Emma smiled, stretching her arms above her head. "Just wrapping up some projections for tomorrow's meeting." He walked over and glanced at the screen. "You've outdone yourself again. The board's going to be impressed." "I hope so," she said, closing the laptop. "I want this launch to be perfect." Mark hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I've been thinking about something, and I wanted to run it by you." Emma tilted her head, curious. "What is it?" "We've been expanding rapidly, and I can't think of anyone better suited to help lead that growth than you," Mark said. "I want you to consider taking on the role of Chief Operating Officer." Emma's breath hitched. "Cool. You've earned it," Mark said simply. "And I believe in you." The weight of his words settled over her, but this time, it wasn't overwhelming. It was empowering. She had worked for this. She had earned it. "I'll think about it," she said, her voice steady. As she left the office that night, the city seemed brighter, the air crisper, and her heart lighter. For the first time in a long time, Emma felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. She wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. And Nathan's absence no longer felt like a loss. It felt like freedom. The night sky over Manhattan was a velvet expanse dotted with flickering lights, but Nathan Thornton barely noticed as he leaned against the balcony railing of his penthouse, his mind racing with thoughts of impending disaster. The cool breeze did little to calm the growing panic in his chest. Below him, the city continued its relentless pulse of activity, indifferent to the unraveling of his carefully constructed life. Nathan gripped his glass of whiskey tightly, swirling the amber liquid as if it held the answers he so desperately needed. The dim glow of the city lights reflected faintly off the surface, but there were no answers here, only reminders of how quickly everything could slip away. He took a long sip, the burn trailing down his throat, and turned to face the chaos inside. The once pristine living room now felt suffocating. Documents were scattered across the coffee table, financial reports and investor updates marked with red ink, a sea of warnings that Nathan had tried to ignore. His phone buzzed incessantly on the couch, its vibration grating on his nerves. He knew what the calls meant. More investors pulling out, more board members demanding explanations, more pressure he couldn't contain. For years, Nathan had been the golden boy of the corporate world. His aggressive investment strategies and sharp business instincts had propelled him to the top, earning him accolades and wealth beyond his wildest dreams. But now, those same strategies had become his downfall. The tech sector was shifting, markets were volatile, and the acquisitions he had once been praised for were now bleeding his company dry. The sound of heels clicking against the marble floor pulled him from his thoughts. Claire entered the room, her perfectly styled hair framing her face as she approached him with a glass of wine in hand. She looked every bit the polished executive, but there was a tension in her posture that Nathan couldn't ignore. "We need to talk," she said, setting the wine down on the table. Nathan ran a hand through his hair, his frustration barely contained. "Let me guess, another investor has cold feet?" Claire crossed her arms, her gaze unwavering. "More than that. Foster Tech officially backed out of the partnership today. They cited concerns about our liquidity." Nathan's jaw tightened. "We can recover from this. We've been through worse." Claire shook her head, her expression hardening. "No, Nathan, we haven't. This isn't just a bump in the road. It's a full-blown crisis, and you know it." He turned away, pacing the room as his thoughts raced. "We just need time. I'm working on securing a bridge loan. You've been saying that for weeks." Claire interrupted, her voice rising. And the board is losing patience. They don't trust you anymore. Nathan's hands balled into fists at his sides. He wasn't used to being questioned like this, especially not by someone who had once been his most loyal ally. So what do you suggest, Claire? That I just roll over and let them strip me of everything I've built? Claire hesitated, and the pause was enough to make Nathan's stomach churn. Maybe it's time to consider selling off some of the assets, she said carefully. We could salvage what's left and… No, Nathan snapped, cutting her off. I'm not selling. Her gaze softened, but there was a hint of pity behind her eyes that made his skin crawl. Nathan, you're not thinking clearly. This isn't about pride. It's about survival. Don't lecture me about survival, he growled, downing the rest of his whiskey and slamming the glass on the table. I've been surviving my entire life. Claire sighed and stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. Then stop fighting everyone and start listening. You're not invincible. The words stung more than he expected, and for a brief moment, Nathan felt the weight of her truth settle over him like a heavy cloak. But he wasn't ready to give up, not yet. He pulled away from her touch and grabbed his phone, ignoring the string of missed calls from board members and instead dialing his lawyer. I'll fix this, he muttered to himself as the line rang. I always do. But as the phone went to voicemail, a sinking feeling gripped his chest. For the first time in years, Nathan wasn't sure if he could. The following morning, Nathan arrived at the company headquarters with a determined stride, his tailored suit masking the turmoil raging beneath the surface. The building, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a battleground. Employees greeted him with polite nods, but he could see the unease in their eyes. They had heard the rumors, and fear was contagious. Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere was tense. The long mahogany table stretched before him, flanked by stone-faced executives who had once celebrated his every move. Now, they looked at him with skepticism, their loyalty hanging by a thread. Let's get straight to the point, one of the senior board members said, his tone cold. We're hemorrhaging money, and the market isn't responding well to our restructuring efforts. What's your plan, Nathan? Nathan straightened his posture, channeling the confidence that had carried him this far. We're pursuing a bridge loan from International Finance Corporation. They've shown interest, and I'm finalizing the terms this week. And if that falls through, another board member pressed. It won't, Nathan replied, though even he could hear the strain in his voice. The board members exchanged glances, their silent communication speaking volumes. Finally, the chairman leaned forward, folding his hands on the table. We need more than vague assurances. The shareholders are getting restless, and if we don't see tangible results soon, we'll be forced to consider alternative leadership. Nathan's breath caught in his throat, but he didn't flinch. I understand your concerns, but I've built this company from the ground up. No one is more invested in its success than I am. That may be true, the chairman said, but the company's future isn't tied to your personal history. It's tied to performance. The meeting adjourned shortly after, leaving Nathan alone in the boardroom, staring at the empty seats. His fingers tapped rhythmically against the polished surface of the table as he replayed the conversation in his head. They didn't trust him anymore. His power, once absolute, was slipping away. As he stepped outside, the cool autumn air hit him like a slap. He checked his phone, hoping for good news, but instead found a single message from Claire. We need to talk. Urgent. He met her at a high-end cafe later that afternoon, the kind of place they used to frequent when things were simpler. Claire sat by the window, her gaze distant as she sipped her coffee. When Nathan slid into the seat across from her, she didn't look up immediately. I spoke to the board, she said finally, setting her cup down. They're weighing their options. Nathan's stomach twisted. Which means what? Claire sighed. It means they've already started discussions about replacing you as CEO. A bitter laugh escaped him. I should have known they'd turn on me the moment things got tough. It's not about betrayal, she said softly. It's about business. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of her words pressing down on him. And what about you, Claire? Are you turning on me too? Her silence was answer enough. Nathan stared at her, a wave of emotions crashing over him. Betrayal, regret, anger. But above all, there was the crushing realization that the empire he had built was crumbling, and there was no one left to help him hold it together. As he left the cafe, his phone buzzed again, but this time, the name on the screen made him freeze. Emma. He hesitated before answering, the sound of her voice stirring memories he had buried deep. "Hello, Nathan," she said calmly. "We need to talk." And just like that, the past he thought he had left behind was standing on his doorstep, ready to deliver the blow that would change everything. The view from Emma's office was breathtaking, with the city skyline stretching far into the distance and the afternoon sun casting golden rays over the towering buildings below. It was a view that reminded her of how far she'd come. From the woman crying alone on the kitchen floor to a leader capable of making decisions that reshaped industries. But today, the view was merely background noise to the storm of thoughts swirling inside her. Emma leaned back in her leather chair, her fingers drumming lightly against the armrest as she studied the documents spread across her desk. The proposal for the acquisition of Nathan Thornton's struggling company sat front and center, its pages filled with financial projections, market assessments, and the strategic benefits of the takeover. It was all meticulously laid out, each figure carefully calculated to demonstrate why this move made sense for her company. And yet, it wasn't the numbers that made her hesitate. It was the name at the top of the report, Thornton Enterprises. She had known this day would come eventually, ever since Mark first proposed the idea of expanding into new markets and targeting companies on the brink of collapse. But she hadn't expected fate to align so perfectly, to deliver Nathan's company into her hands just as it teetered on the edge of failure. It was almost poetic. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. Mark's name flashed across the screen, and she answered on the second ring. "Hi, Mark." "Hey." His voice came through warm and steady, a welcome anchor amid her inner turmoil. "Did you have a chance to review the acquisition plan?" "I did," she replied, glancing at the report again. "Everything looks solid." "Good," Mark said. "The board is ready to move forward. We just need your final approval." Emma exhaled, leaning forward to rest her elbows on the desk. "It's not the numbers I'm worried about. You know that." There was a brief pause on the other end before Mark spoke again, his tone softer this time. "I know, but you can't let your history with Nathan cloud your judgment. This is a business decision, and it's the right one." She knew he was right. Nathan's downfall wasn't her doing. It was the result of years of risky decisions and neglected responsibilities. But still, the thought of facing him again stirred something complicated inside her. Would he see this as an act of revenge? Would he think she had been waiting for this moment, lying in wait like a predator stalking its prey? "I'm not doing this to humiliate him," she said, more to herself than to Mark. "I know you're not," Mark reassured her. "And if it helps, you're not the one who put him in this position. Nathan did that all on his own." Emma closed her eyes, letting his words sink in. She had spent years thinking that Nathan's choices defined her worth, but they didn't. His failures weren't her burden to carry anymore. "I'll sign off on it," she said finally, her voice steady. "Let's move forward." Mark's relief was palpable. "You're making the right call. I'll notify the legal team and set up a meeting with Thornton Enterprises to finalize the terms." After hanging up, Emma sat in silence for a moment, her gaze fixed on the city beyond her window. She had built something incredible, something Nathan had once dismissed her as incapable of achieving. And now, she was about to prove just how wrong he had been. The following week, Emma arrived at the high-rise office building where Thornton Enterprises headquarters were located. Dressed in a tailored navy suit that hugged her frame perfectly, she exuded the confidence of a woman who had earned her place at the table. Her heels clicked against the marble floor as she made her way to the elevator, her presence commanding attention without effort. As she rode up to the top floor, memories of the last time she had been in a building like this flooded her mind. Back then, she had been the wife waiting patiently for her husband to finish his meetings, her opinions dismissed as irrelevant. But today, she wasn't here to wait for anyone. She was here to take control. When the elevator doors opened, she was greeted by the sight of Thornton Enterprises' receptionist, a young woman with a nervous smile who gestured toward the conference room. "They're expecting you, Ms. Whitaker." Emma nodded politely and walked past the rows of cubicles and glass-walled offices. She could feel the eyes of the employees on her, their whispers barely concealed as they speculated about her presence. The air was thick with tension, and she relished it. This was her moment. Inside the conference room, the atmosphere was tense. Nathan sat at the head of the table, his once commanding presence diminished by the weight of his recent failures. His suit, though expensive, seemed to hang on him differently, like armor that no longer fit. His eyes widened slightly when he saw Emma enter, but he quickly masked his surprise with a forced smile. "Emma," he said, rising to greet her. "It's been a while." She met his gaze head-on, her expression calm and unreadable.
"It has."
They shook hands briefly before taking their seats on opposite sides of the table. The room was filled with lawyers and executives, but for a moment, it felt like it was just the two of them, their shared history lingering in the air like an unspoken secret. Nathan cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "I have to admit, I didn't expect to see you leading this acquisition." Emma's lips curved into a small smile. "A lot has changed since we last saw each other." He leaned back in his chair, studying her with a mixture of curiosity and something else, perhaps regret. "So it has." The legal teams began the formal discussion, going over the terms of the acquisition and the transition plan for Thornton Enterprises. Emma listened intently, occasionally chiming in to clarify a point or suggest a modification. But throughout the meeting, she could feel Nathan's eyes on her, as if he were trying to piece together how she had risen to this level of power without him noticing. When the meeting finally adjourned and the others filed out of the room, Nathan lingered behind. Emma gathered her notes, fully aware that he was waiting for an opportunity to speak to her privately. "You've done well for yourself," he said, breaking the silence. Emma glanced up, meeting his gaze.
"I have."
Nathan ran a hand through his hair, his expression shifting to something more vulnerable. "I never wanted things to end like this." Emma's grip tightened around the edge of her notebook, but she kept her voice steady. "You made your choices, Nathan, and so did I." He nodded slowly, as if the weight of her words carried a truth he couldn't deny. "Do you ever think about what we had?" She stood, straightening her blazer. "I used to, but not anymore." The finality in her tone left no room for argument. As she walked toward the door, Nathan called out one last time. "Emma, do you hate me?" She paused, her hand resting on the doorframe. "No, Nathan, I don't hate you. I've moved on. You should try doing the same." With that, she left the room, her heels clicking confidently against the floor as she walked away from the man who had once defined her world. But now, she was the one writing the story, and this chapter was just beginning. The boardroom was an expanse of glass and steel, its minimalist design reflecting an air of sterile professionalism. The long conference table gleamed under the soft glow of overhead lights, and outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city stretched endlessly, bustling as always. But inside this room, the air was suffocatingly tense. Every rustle of paper, every throat cleared, seemed magnified by the silence that followed. Emma sat calmly near the center of the table, her posture perfect, her face a mask of composure. She had chosen her outfit carefully, an ivory blouse paired with a fitted charcoal blazer and matching slacks, a look that was elegant yet assertive. Her hair was pulled back into a sleek ponytail, exposing her sharp features and the glint of determination in her eyes. The leather briefcase by her side held everything she needed, but her real weapon was her presence. Today was not just a meeting, it was a reckoning. Nathan Thornton entered the room moments later, his gaze sweeping over the assembled group before landing on Emma. For a split second, something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, shock, maybe even regret. But he quickly masked it with the practiced confidence he was known for. His tailored navy suit fit perfectly, but there was something different about him today, something off. The slight slump in his shoulders, the tension around his mouth. It was subtle, but Emma noticed it. She always noticed. Nathan made his way to the head of the table, shaking hands with a few executives along the way. When he finally reached Emma, he hesitated just long enough for the silence to feel heavy. "Emma," he said, offering a polite smile. She met his gaze, her own smile small but unwavering.
"Nathan."
The simplicity of their exchange carried a weight neither of them acknowledged. As they sat down, the legal teams began their introductions and outlined the agenda. Contracts shuffled, pins clicked, and laptops hummed to life. But Emma's focus wasn't on the documents. It was on the man sitting across from her, the man who had once dismissed her dreams as secondary to his own. Nathan had built an empire, and now it was crumbling. The irony wasn't lost on her. The meeting dragged on, filled with discussions of asset valuation, market position, and transition planning. Emma contributed strategically, her voice steady as she outlined her company's vision for integrating Thornton Enterprises into their larger business model. Every time she spoke, Nathan's eyes flicked toward her, as though trying to decipher the woman she had become. When the meeting reached a brief intermission, Nathan approached her by the window where she stood, gazing out at the sprawling cityscape. "It's strange seeing you here," he said, his voice low enough to keep their conversation private. In this role, Emma turned to face him, her expression neutral. "Why is it strange, Nathan? Did you think I wasn't capable of something like this?" He shifted uncomfortably, running a hand through his hair. "It's not that. I guess I didn't expect you to be leading the company that's buying mine. Most people don't expect consequences until they're standing in front of them," Emma replied, her tone even but pointed. Nathan winced, but he recovered quickly. "I know things between us didn't end well." "That's an understatement," she said, crossing her arms. "You left me when I needed you most, Nathan. I won't sugarcoat that just because we're doing business now." He exhaled, leaning against the window ledge. "I made mistakes." Emma arched an eyebrow. "You did. But this isn't about personal mistakes anymore. It's about business. And right now, your business is failing." Nathan's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. "I didn't expect you to come back into my life like this. I didn't plan it," she admitted. "But here we are." They stood in silence for a moment, the hum of distant conversations filling the background. Finally, Nathan spoke again, his voice softer this time. "Do you think we can come out of this as something other than enemies?" Emma tilted her head slightly, considering his words. "I don't see you as my enemy, Nathan, but I'm not the woman you left behind anymore. I don't need you to validate my success or my choices. I see that now," he said, his gaze dropping briefly to the floor before meeting hers again. "I was blind back then." Emma didn't deny it. Instead, she took a step closer, her voice firm but not unkind. "This isn't about the past. It's about what comes next. You still have a role to play in this company if you're willing to cooperate. But if you fight me on this, you'll lose." Nathan stared at her, and for the first time, she saw something real in his eyes. Vulnerability, maybe even fear. "I don't want to lose everything, Emma." "Then don't," she said simply. "Work with us. Be the leader your company needs during this transition. Show your employees that you care about their future, even if it's not under your control anymore." Her words hung between them, heavy but full of opportunity. She wasn't here to humiliate him, despite what he might have expected. She was offering him a chance to salvage his dignity, to be part of the solution instead of the problem. Nathan nodded slowly, as if the weight of her offer was just beginning to sink in. "Okay," he said finally. "I'll cooperate." Emma gave a small nod. "Good. Then let's finish this." The rest of the meeting went smoothly, with Nathan contributing where necessary and the legal teams ironing out the final details. When the last contract was signed, Emma stood, gathering her belongings as the executives filed out of the room. Nathan lingered behind once again, watching her as she adjusted the strap of her briefcase. "Emma," he said, his voice stopping her before she reached the door. She turned, her hand resting on the doorknob. "What is it, Nathan?" He hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "I'm sorry. For everything." Her heart clenched, but she didn't let it show. "I appreciate that," she said softly. "But apologies won't change what happened." "I know," he admitted, "but I needed to say it." Emma studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Take care of yourself, Nathan." With that, she left the room, the weight of their past finally lifting as she walked away. The cool air hit her as she stepped outside, and she breathed it in deeply, savoring the freedom of the moment. She had faced the man who had once broken her, and she had come out stronger. This wasn't revenge, it was closure. And as she looked up at the towering skyline, she realized that her journey was far from over. There were still more mountains to climb, more victories to claim. But for now, she was exactly where she needed to be. Nathan Thornton sat alone in his office, the heavy oak door closed behind him, blocking out the noise of the bustling headquarters. The blinds were drawn halfway, allowing slivers of sunlight to filter in, casting fractured patterns on the floor. His fingers tapped nervously against the glass of scotch in his hand as he leaned back in his chair, staring blankly at the documents spread out on his desk. The ink had barely dried on the acquisition agreement, and yet it already felt like a tombstone marking the death of everything he had built. Thornton Enterprises, once a titan in the tech and finance sectors, was now under the control of Whitestone Technologies, Emma's company. His empire, gone in what felt like a blink of an eye. The scotch burned as he downed the last of it, but it did nothing to soothe the ache that gnawed at him. The ache wasn't just from the financial loss. It was from the knowledge that Emma had seen the cracks in his foundation long before he did. She had waited, prepared, and made her move when the timing was perfect. And she hadn't done it out of revenge. That's what stung the most. This wasn't a petty vendetta. It was business, and she had outplayed him fairly. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He sighed, setting the empty glass down and loosening his tie before calling out, "Come in." Claire stepped inside, her expression carefully neutral as she closed the door behind her. Her presence used to fill him with a sense of control. She was sharp, ambitious, and always ready to strategize their next big move. But now, she was just another reminder of how everything had fallen apart. "We need to talk," she said, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor as she crossed the room and sat in the chair opposite him. Nathan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "If this is about the transition plan, I'm already aware. I'll cooperate." Claire shook her head. "It's not just about that. It's about us." He blinked, confused by the sudden shift. "What do you mean?" She exhaled, her gaze steady but lacking the warmth it once had. "I think it's time we part ways." For a moment, Nathan couldn't process the words. "Part ways?" he repeated, leaning back in his chair. "You're leaving me?" Claire folded her hands in her lap, her voice calm and measured. "We both knew this wasn't permanent, Nathan. It worked while it worked, but things have changed. I need to think about my future." He let out a bitter laugh, the sound hollow and filled with disbelief. "So, you're jumping ship now that things aren't perfect?" "It's not about perfection," Claire replied, her tone sharp. "It's about survival. And right now, you're sinking." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut, but he refused to show it. Instead, he smirked, leaning forward again. "Funny. You were more than happy to ride this wave when the money was flowing." Claire didn't flinch. "I was. But I'm not going down with you, Nathan." The silence that followed was suffocating. Nathan stared at her, the weight of her words pressing down on him like a lead blanket. He had thought she would stick by him, at least long enough to see if he could turn things around. But just like everything else in his life, Claire was slipping away. She stood, smoothing down the front of her skirt. "I'm sorry, Nathan. I really am. But I have to do what's best for me." Before he could respond, she was gone, the door clicking shut behind her. Nathan sat in the silence she left behind, his mind spinning. Claire had been his partner in both business and pleasure, the one person he thought he could count on. But now, even she had abandoned him. He pushed his chair back and stood, pacing the length of the room as frustration bubbled to the surface. His phone buzzed on the desk, and he snatched it up without checking the caller ID. "What?" he barked into the phone. The voice on the other end was calm and professional. "Mr. Thornton, this is David from Public Relations. I thought you should know. Emma Whitaker's acquisition of Thornton Enterprises has gone public. The press release was just distributed, and the media is already running with it." Nathan's grip tightened around the phone. "And what are they saying?" David hesitated, which only made Nathan's stomach knot tighter. "It's not favorable. Most outlets are framing it as a fall from grace story. They're focusing on how you lost control of the company you built and how Whitestone Technologies swooped in to save it." Nathan closed his eyes, breathing through the wave of anger and humiliation that crashed over him. And Emma? She's being portrayed as a strategic genius, David replied. The narrative is that she recognized the weaknesses in your company and positioned herself to take over when the time was right. The media is praising her. Of course they were. Emma had played the game perfectly, and now she was reaping the rewards. He thanked David curtly and ended the call, tossing the phone onto the desk as if it had personally betrayed him. His head pounded, and he poured himself another drink, the liquid sloshing in the glass as his hand trembled. He had always prided himself on being untouchable, on staying ahead of the competition. But now, the world knew he had been beaten, and by the very woman he had once cast aside. Later that evening, as darkness fell over the city, Nathan found himself sitting in the back of a cab, heading toward a destination he hadn't planned on visiting. The streetlights blurred past the window, casting fleeting shadows over his face as he stared at his reflection. He barely recognized himself anymore. When the cab came to a stop outside Whitestone Technologies headquarters, Nathan hesitated before stepping out. The building loomed above him, its glass facade gleaming in the dim light. He entered through the revolving doors, his footsteps echoing against the marble floor as he made his way to the reception desk. The receptionist looked up, startled by the sight of him. "Mr. Thornton? I'm here to see Emma," he said, his voice rough. After a brief call, the receptionist gestured toward the elevator. "She's expecting you." The elevator ride felt endless, the soft hum of the machinery doing little to calm his nerves. When the doors finally opened, he stepped into Emma's office, where she sat behind a sleek wooden desk, her fingers flying across her laptop keyboard. She looked up, her expression cool and unreadable. "Nathan." He closed the door behind him and approached her desk, unsure of what he had come here to say. "I saw the headlines." Emma nodded, folding her hands in front of her. "I expected you would." Nathan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Is this how you imagined it would end?" Emma leaned back in her chair, her gaze steady. "I didn't imagine this at all."
But it's where we are.
"I don't know how to move forward," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. She studied him for a moment before standing and walking around the desk to face him. "Then figure it out, Nathan. You're not the only one who's had to start over." Her words, though firm, weren't cruel. There was no malice in her tone, just truth. And for the first time, Nathan realized that Emma wasn't here to destroy him. She had moved beyond their past, and now he had to do the same. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice cracking. Emma nodded, her eyes softening slightly. "I know." As he left her office, the weight of his failure felt heavier than ever. But buried beneath the humiliation was a spark of something else, a chance to rebuild, to start again. Because if Emma could rise from the ashes, maybe he could too. Emma stood by the window of her corner office, gazing out at the city skyline bathed in the soft light of dawn. The glass panes reflected the vibrant hues of the rising sun, casting warm golden streaks across her desk and the polished floor beneath her feet. The city, always bustling and alive, was still waking up, but Emma had been here for hours, reviewing reports and preparing for the next chapter of Whitestone Technologies' expansion. Today was different, though. Today marked the official start of the transition following the acquisition of Thornton Enterprises, and with it, the culmination of a journey that had tested every ounce of her resolve. The last few weeks had been a whirlwind of legal meetings, press conferences, and strategic planning. But as she stood here now, a deep sense of fulfillment settled over her. She had done it, not out of spite or vengeance, but because she had earned it. The sound of a knock on her door broke her thoughts. "Come in," she called, turning just as Mark entered, a cup of coffee in each hand. "Figured you could use this," he said, handing her one of the cups. He leaned against the edge of her desk, his easy smile as familiar as ever. "Big day. Biggest one yet," Emma agreed, taking a sip of the rich, warm coffee. "Thanks for coming in early." Mark shrugged. "Couldn't miss the chance to see history being made." Emma laughed softly, setting the cup down on her desk. "You're making it sound more dramatic than it is." "It is dramatic," Mark said, his expression turning more serious. "You've taken a company that was on the verge of collapse and turned it into something viable again. And you've done it while redefining your own path. That's no small feat, Emma smiled, but there was a quiet humility behind it. It's not just me. We've had a great team, and you've been by my side through all of this. Mark tilted his head, studying her for a moment. You know, Emma, there's a lot of people out there who would have used this situation to crush Nathan, to make sure he never recovered. Her gaze shifted toward the window again, her thoughts briefly drifting to her encounter with Nathan in her office the night before. His vulnerability had been so raw, so unlike the man she remembered. He had been humbled, yes, but there had also been a flicker of something else, perhaps the first hint of genuine growth. I didn't need to crush him, Emma said quietly.
That's not who I am.
Mark nodded, his admiration evident. And that's why you're going to keep winning. Later that morning, Emma walked into the main conference room, where the final meeting to cement the transition was about to begin. Executives from both companies filled the room, their conversations buzzing with anticipation. She moved confidently through the crowd, exchanging polite greetings and handshakes before taking her seat at the head of the table. Nathan entered moments later, and for the first time since their initial reunion, he looked somewhat composed. His suit was impeccable, and though the shadows under his eyes hinted at sleepless nights, there was a steadiness to his demeanor that hadn't been there before. Emma, he said as he took the seat opposite her. Ready to finalize this? She met his gaze with a small nod. Let's get started. The meeting proceeded smoothly, with the legal teams presenting the final documents for signature. As each page was signed and initialed, Emma felt a sense of closure settling over her. What had once been a painful chapter in her life was now officially behind her, transformed into an opportunity for growth and success. When the last signature was placed, the room erupted in polite applause. Emma stood, accepting congratulations from the executives around her, but her focus remained on the bigger picture. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a new phase, both for her company and for herself. As the meeting concluded and the room began to empty, Nathan lingered behind once again. This time, though, the air between them felt different, less charged with unspoken tension, more reflective. I meant what I said last night, Nathan said, his voice softer than usual. I'm sorry. Emma folded her arms, studying him for a moment. I believe you. He seemed to relax slightly, but there was still something weighing on him. Do you think I have a chance to rebuild? I do, Emma said honestly, but it won't be easy. You'll have to be willing to change. Nathan nodded, as if he had already accepted that. I'm willing. She extended her hand, and for a moment, he stared at it before shaking it firmly. It wasn't a gesture of forgiveness or reconciliation. It was an acknowledgement that their paths had diverged and that they were both moving forward. Good luck, Nathan, she said, releasing his hand. Thank you, he replied, his voice carrying a note of sincerity she hadn't heard from him in years. Later that afternoon, Emma left the office and made her way to her car, the crisp autumn air nipping at her cheeks. She had a meeting scheduled with Mark later in the day, but first, there was somewhere she needed to be. She drove through the bustling city streets, the hum of traffic and the blur of pedestrians fading into the background as she focused on the road ahead. When she arrived at the school, she parked and made her way to the entrance. The bell had just rung, and children poured out of the building, their laughter and chatter filling the air. Emma spotted her son, a bright-eyed boy with curly brown hair, running toward her with a wide grin. Mommy, he called, his little backpack bouncing against his shoulders as he ran into her arms. Emma knelt down, wrapping him in a warm embrace. Hey, sweetheart, how was school? Great. I drew a picture of us today, he said excitedly, pulling a crumpled piece of paper from his bag. See? It's me, you, and Uncle Mark. Emma laughed softly, her heart swelling with love as she examined the drawing. It's perfect. As they walked hand in hand back to the car, Emma felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. She had fought hard to get to this point, but the rewards weren't just measured in business success or financial gains. They were measured in moments like this, moments where she could show her son that resilience, hard work, and kindness could create a life worth living. As they drove home, the city faded into the background, and Emma allowed herself a moment to reflect. The woman she had once been, The one who had cried alone when Nathan walked out was long gone. In her place stood a woman who had built an empire, who had learned to thrive even when the odds were stacked against her. And the best part? Her story was far from over.